Thanks, everyone. Happy to be here. Once again, my name is Westbrook Johnson, and I do come from Adobe. And today we are going to talk about scaling up and scaling down with web components. Before we get started, let's take a little moment to come together and agree on what scaling means, because not only does it mean a lot of things, but it can be used in a lot of ways. And we're going to focus on one more particular area of scaling in today's talk. First, we're going to start at what it means to deliver something at application scale, which for this is going to be our base scale. And working from there, we're going to scale down to the quality ingredients that are required to make quality applications. From there, we're going to scale back up to talk about how once you've measured twice on those quality ingredients, you can start making not just one, but 2 or 50, or if you're crazy, 500 applications with those ingredients. And then we'll sort of scale a little bit to the left and talk about how an ecosystem of applications might need some things that are traditionally thought of as micro front ends in order to ensure you're delivering a consistent experience between them. And then we'll go full scale, which is like the new full stack, I think, if any of you are developers in the room. And we're going to talk about how web components help you integrate with not just your own company, but other companies as well. So before I get started, let's just come together on what makes me qualified to talk to you about this today. And what could make me more qualified than the fact that I have built my slides today in web components? Here's a quick code example. Half of you might say, oh, that makes you crazy. The other half of you might say, oh, that makes you a developer. I'm not sure that I'd argue with any of you. But in reality, some more applicable things are I'm a core team member of the Modern Web open source project, which helps bring tooling together for both building and testing your web applications. I'm also a core team member of the Open Web Components project, which helps to ease your path into developing web components by sharing some hard-earned opinions on how you should be developing web components. I'm also the chairperson for the W3C's Web Component Community Group, and I would highly recommend that if you are interested in web components, whether you're wearing a pink badge today, or you're wearing a blue badge today, or the few of you that are wearing yellow badges, check out this link and join us in the conversation there. We're making web components better for everyone, the whole world over. But as mentioned, I am from Adobe, and there I'm the tech lead of the Spectrum Web Components project. And it's going to be a lot of the basis of what we talked about today. But before I get too deep into that, I assume, much like before I joined Adobe, that when you think of Adobe, you think Photoshop. I mean, it's not very many companies in the world that have created a product that has gone on to become its own verb, right? And more recently, not only is it a verb, but we have been verbing on the web. And here is a quick snapshot of what it looks like to use Photoshop on the web. If you've used Photoshop not on the web, you may not completely see the difference, or you might, because there's a lot of differences between what we're shipping on the desktop and what we're shipping on the web. But it might come as a surprise. We're delivering this with web components. It might also come as a surprise that you can't tell the difference from this screenshot. And so I'd like you to start taking some takeaways from our conversation today. And the first is that if you are interested in whether an application is leveraging web components or not, you can install the Custom Elements Locator plugin to your Chrome browser. Here is a link for that, and it will immediately allow you to see what custom elements are being leveraged in the applications that you visit. For instance, now that we've seen that Photoshop is on the web, and we've created our brand new document on the web, once we run Custom Elements Locator, we see that there are 88 custom elements that are needed to display this empty document page in your browser. So our first takeaway is leverage Custom Elements Locator if you're learning about the applications that you visit, and you want to know whether they, too, or how they are leveraging web components. But getting back to our 88 components that we see in the Photoshop web application, what does the 88 custom elements even look like? Well, protect your eyes. Here are the 88 custom elements and the tag names that are registered to deliver those to you in the browser for our blank document in Photoshop Web. Don't worry too much about memorizing these, though I would give you a handshake if you did. But let's talk a little bit about what all of these components start to look like. So for delivering Photoshop Web-specific capabilities, there are 46 custom elements that are prefixed with the PSW-custom element prefix. These 46 components offer Photoshop-specific capabilities, and like your panels and your crop and your cut sorts of interactions, and they're paired with 11 higher-level compositions of individual design patterns, as outlined by the UE- and the XUE- custom element prefix. And underlying all of those are 31 SP- custom element tags. These custom element tags we're going to take a closer look at, because it's the SP- custom element tags that make up the library I work on, Spectrum Web Components. Here is a quick preview of the documentations for Spectrum Web Components. And if you are entrepreneurial or ingenious and you've already installed your custom elements locator, you can follow this QR code and take a look right now as to how many custom elements are leveraged on this page. But I won't bury the lead. And I'll tell you there are 11. And I know that Keck, who was speaking with us just a minute ago, really loves sidebars. And he would say there is definitely more than 11 custom elements to build the sidebar that we just saw. You might be right, because while I showed you our desktop view, I did a little bit of a lie. And I ran this custom element locator not on our desktop view, but on our mobile view, where that sidebar is hidden. I'm sorry, Keck. And it's here that we're seeing 11 custom elements. When you actually compare this to our desktop, you see 23 custom elements. And so you're able to get an understanding of one of the superpowers that comes along with custom elements, and that is that custom elements are great for lazy loading. Just because you define them doesn't mean you have to send them over the wire, and just because you send them over the wire doesn't mean you have to use them. And this is what it looks like were you to lazy load, for instance, the SP button, which is our button custom element for Spectrum Web Components. Here we're using a dynamic import in JavaScript to load that custom element registration. And if we had not loaded this code, our blue button with white click me text would act almost as if it were a span and have no functionality or design delivered with it. Now, alongside of the SP button, Spectrum Web Components is built of 83 individual Spectrum pattern delivering custom elements. And that is partnered with more than 900 public icon elements that are prefixed with SP icon. And together they bring you a myriad of design patterns from the Spectrum ecosystem. Whether we're talking about buttons, or inputs, or pickers, or color fields, or cards, all of these components come together to build the applications you see all across the Adobe ecosystem. And you might think, with all of this functionality, how could anyone build a roadmap and focus on any of the things that you might ship? How might you not fall a couple of versions behind? And the way that we do that is we rely on the browser-powered encapsulation that comes along with Shadow DOM. Here we see a quick example of how you might attach a shadow root to a custom element that you've defined. Here we have our shadow root being connected, and here's our custom element that we're defining. And we're then injecting some content from our template. And this is really good to know because it talks about where we come from as developers, but it's also nice to know that generally, if you're going to be building with something like a base class, you might never have to write this code yourself. For instance, Spectrum Web Components builds on top of the lit element base class as provided by Google. And all of the binding of shadow roots to the custom element are done for us. So as much as it's good to know this code, you might never have to write it. But once someone, whether it's you or it's your base class, are writing this code, you start to have some special capabilities that allow you to focus more on what you're doing. First of all, that shadow boundary that we created by attaching shadow to our custom element protects our content from CSS selectors. That means, in our example here, that while we have our custom element with a shadow root bound with the declarative shadow root syntax, which is a little different than what we saw. This is for demo, predominantly for demo only because it makes the code a little shorter for me to talk about. But in our custom element, we have the h1 tag that we saw before. And outside of our custom element, our consumer has written some styles for h1 tags. And we see that they're expecting the h1 tag to be red. However, there is a shadow boundary between their styles and our h1 tag, and that prevents the h1 tag from being read. Similarly, as you work your way down the demo, you'll see that there's a query selector in our JavaScript. Traditionally, working from the document, you'd be able to query all of the elements that are in the page. But because, again, there's a shadow boundary between where the query selector is being made and where our h1 tag lives, our query selector all doesn't have access to that, and we'll see a null as opposed to an array containing the h1 in our custom element. Beyond that, Shadow DOM gives us a better control over our API. And while some of that can be functional, and there are some great talks about that, we're going to look at about how that gives you advanced control over your styling API. Here, we're sort of building on the custom element we saw before. We have our h1 that we had in the last couple of examples, but we've also added a p tag. And this p tag has a special attribute called a part that's set to content. Alongside of that, inside of our shadow root, we also have a style for our h1, where we've opened essentially a style gateway for our color by applying a CSS custom property that our consumers can directly apply from the outside. CSS custom properties inherit through the shadow boundary. So at the top where we see our root applying a value to custom color primary, this red color will now be applied to our h1. Similarly, the part attribute that I discussed builds on the finite control that you would get with a CSS custom property and gives you essentially splat control, full control over an element inside of a shadow root. And so we're able to see in our second style rule, as we point to the part content, that we can apply whatever styles, here margin and color and line height, to customize the content that's inside of the shadow root. And it's with this power that you can make really solid decisions with your designers and with your clients what sort of things the consumers or the viewers of your application are able to customize when they use their custom elements over and again to build a larger ecosystem of capability. On top of that, you're also freed to make more drastic edits between versions, because what's inside of the Shadow DOM stays inside of the Shadow DOM. And that means in our imaginary, our demonstrative v1.0.0 custom element here on the top, we have again our h1. But as we move, we decide that we need to make some edits, and we want that h1 to be downgraded to an h2, and we also want to change a little bit of its content order into the second version. Traditionally, this would be counted as a breaking change. So you'd need to move from Simver 1.0 to Simver 2.0 because things that your consumers might have done to that custom element might require that content order, might require that tag name. But because we're bound inside of the shadow root, this tag name change or the content order changes that we're seeing, or also more in depth, the class name that we're applying to the image tag here, all while previously being breaking changes to your custom element, are bound within the context of our shadow root. So only our addition of some default content needs to be worried as we make Simver changes. And so we can count this as either a minor or a feature change, depending on how you translate Simver, and we can go from 1.0.0 to 1.1.0 rather than needing to make the breaking change to 2.0. This means that our custom elements, as we make changes to them, we can know that they're less likely to affect changes in other custom elements or the application that they're consumed in. And it allows us to focus on when we want those custom elements to have effect in the cases that we're using them. So the takeaway here is that encapsulation via shadow root allows you to focus your work and be very specific on what you're doing and what sorts of things that work is going to have a side effect on. However, with great power comes great responsibility, absolutely. And so once you choose to bind a shadow root to your custom element, there are some things that you should take into account that you may not have had to take into account before. First of all, while you have all of these new powers, there are several things that you don't have power over. And one of them is style specificity. Here, we're creating a custom element that has a shadow root bound and it has a slot, which is one of the capabilities that comes along with shadow roots. This allows the consumer of your custom element to project content into your shadow root. It also provides for this slotted custom CSS selector, which would generally, you think, allow the P or paragraph element in this demo to be read. However, the slotted selector is very low specificity. So when your consumer makes a P rule or a paragraph rule outside of your custom element, it will override the styles that you might expect to be available on your custom element. So this is just one of the cases where there are a lot of powers you get, but there are some powers that you don't. Similarly, because you have all of these powers, you do need to take into active thought around the APIs that you're creating and the documentation that you want to be structuring in it. For instance, we lazily loaded a Spectrum button before, and there are some places where Spectrum Design, the design system at Adobe, allows you to customize its delivery. In fact, there are this many places. These are all of the CSS custom properties that are allowed within the Spectrum language for you to customize that button. Here we've not used any CSS parts, as we saw in our previous demo, because Spectrum is a controlled language, and the goals for the ecosystem is that you don't get to make a completely different button, but you have some options to massage the button and work within the system as outlined by these CSS custom properties. Beyond that, it's also important to realize the responsibilities that you have around accessibility when you're working with your shadow DOM bearing custom elements. We've heard accessibility a lot already today in the conference, and we're going to hear a lot more about it this afternoon. And as part of that process, you might see this DOM and think, oh, I've created a custom label, and I've created a custom text field. Let's ship it. However, because you have bound custom shadow roots into both of these custom elements, what would normally be establishing an ID reference between this label via the for attribute to the ID of text field inside of our input, the shadow boundaries between the two elements prevent that reference from being made, and this DOM is not accessible. Taking that into account, you'll need to approach your DOM in ways that maybe you haven't in the past. Here we see a slight revision of that code. We still have our custom text field and our custom label elements essentially as two different custom elements. But here, we're opening a slot in our text field that we're passing our label into, and that's wrapped with our label. So that means that the ID reference that's being made by the for attribute lives within the same shadow root as the ID for our text field. So we're able to connect the text that we pass into our label with the text field that's being delivered in these custom element example. So the takeaway here is that encapsulation requires extra planning. Nothing comes for free, but for every bit of extra work you do, you're going to have a bit of extra power. So keep that in mind as you're building the ingredients that you want to use to build your applications. Because once you have quality ingredients, you can build multiple applications. So we looked at Photoshop, but let's take a look at a even newer application at Adobe, Firefly. Firefly is a collection of generative AI tools and mini applications that Adobe released just in the last quarter or so. And there are some things to take into mind about the Firefly project. First, it does leverage generative AI, so it's super buzzwordy. It's in the media, it's in the stock market, it's in the C-suite. And so everyone is really interested in how this comes together. And to bring it together, Adobe is having teams across the company partner to breathe life into things that are generating text fonts and are things that are generating infill for your images all across varying segments of the company. And so it needs, almost more so than ever, to ship with Adobe's design language, Spectrum, so that the teams that are working on it don't collide with each other. But there's an interesting kink. Firefly is built with React. Luckily, web components and custom elements are interoperable across tools. So even though Firefly was built with React, the custom elements that we've just seen in the Spectrum Web Components library can be leveraged in those applications. But for any of you that have already worked with custom elements and web components in the room, you might say, I've heard about this project that says that React is not the best at working with custom elements. And you wouldn't be wrong. I apologize for my QR code being a little overwhelmed by the screen resolution that we have here today, but generally, on the Custom Elements Web Everywhere website, you can learn the support level that any framework gives for custom elements. And you're right, and you'll see here that React is a little peculiar with how it handles attributes and properties, and a little specific with the way that it handles events, in a way that might make it prohibitive for a React application to consume custom elements. However, with the help of Lit Labs' React project, we're able to overcome this. With your custom element definition, as well as some metadata about that custom element, you can pass that into the create component method from the Lit Labs React project. This is Lit Labs, again, by the team at Google. And it will wrap your custom element in a React component, and teams can leverage it just as if they were leveraging any other React component. So whether you're building for you or you're building for other people, whether they're using React or not won't be a problem with custom elements. Beyond React, Spectrum Web Components at Adobe appears in a lot of different frameworks. For instance, Adobe Fonts works with Angular and leverages Spectrum Web Components. Similarly, in Vue.js, the Education Exchange team is leveraging web components. Lightroom Web, which is actually built on an Adobe internal framework that is super secret and super old. I don't know if anyone knows about super old things in this room, but it also leverages web components. And in the complete opposite, super not secret and super brand new, actually as of just last week, Express Beta, a lit application, leverages web components internally. And that's just getting started. So once you have all of these applications leveraging web components and delivering diverse parts of your company's application stack, you might start to find that there are places between the applications that have features that you want to ship. The space between the apps. And generally, you might think that approaches like micro front ends are a good way to leverage that. Micro front ends break the delivery of the UI of an application across team boundaries so that, for lack of a better description, the left side of your page can be owned by team A, and the right side of your page can own by team B, and they can work together if possible, in parallel, if opportune, or completely different directions if necessary for your business goals. And in one case that happens at Adobe is things like commenting. Every document across Adobe requires commenting. And anytime you see a document that can be commented, it might look like this UI that you see here. I'm having a really great conversation with myself here, if you look close enough. So in the context of a web component application, these features are shipped with the CCX web component prefix. And that allows, inside of that, for you to encapsulate mini apps that you're going to ship into mini apps, as well as take into account that whether it's commenting or document history or sharing, that there are things that your application developer shouldn't have to worry about if their focus is editing the pixel in a Photoshop document, or their focus is establishing the layer order of an Illustrator document. And in many cases, this functionality predates the applications that they're leveraged in. I just mentioned Express Beta. It was released last week, and yet it leverages this same commenting experience that Photoshop, released sometime last year, leverages as well. And inside of these mini apps, once again, we're seeing the functionality often built in React. And this is sort of the inverted view of what we saw before. Firefly is a React app that leverages Spectrum web components and web components inside of it, whereas this is the context where we have often a web component application that wants to leverage a React app inside of that. And so with our CCX prefix custom elements and the shadow root that segments the application from the parent application from the mini application, we're able to make that work in a way that is super powerful. So our next takeaway is that web components wrap micro front ends quite nicely. But one of the things about being successful is that you are often asked to build something new. So while we're wrapping these mini applications with web components, the next phase of the work that goes into these is to put web components into these micro front ends. And so that means they're going to leverage Spectrum web components. It also means that they're going to want to continue to be able to release on a different schedule than applications that are consuming them, while also being required to test only the narrowest dependency ranges. And one thing that this is very likely to cause is failed to execute, define on custom element registry, which occurs when either the same custom element tag name is attempted to be defined in the browser, or the same class is used to define multiple tag names. And this sometimes occurs when the names of the custom elements are the same across disparate projects, or when the versions of non-disparate custom elements are attempted to be registered in related projects, as we see with our micro front ends. And while there's a future to be had here, the scoped custom element registries API, it's not yet available anywhere. And so follow this QR code if you're interested in making micro front ends easier with custom elements, because there's a lot of great conversation going on around this, and I believe that there is some early prototyping going on in the Chrome browser. And so hopefully this won't have to be true for long, but you'll keep in mind that custom elements and web components are not awesome yet in micro front ends. But once we've looked at this sort of internal of our application, we want to step outside, and we want to look at what it might look like to partner with other companies. Because scaling to our apps from our ingredients is just one step. We want to scale past our apps into other companies as well. And this works really well because web components are not just interoperable between frameworks, they're interoperable between companies. So for instance, Adobe leverages web components a lot. And Umbraco is also investing in them too. So I thought it might be a good idea for us to see what it would look like for these two companies to work more closely together. So before I steal anyone's thunder, or half of their thunder, realize that after the break, Jakob Overgaard is going to talk more closely about the new back office, but I thought we might take an imaginary tour of what could be possible once web components are leveraged in both of our companies. So if we switch and hopefully figure out how to get back to here. If we swap over into an imaginary web component powered media section of the new back office, we might see some photography that came from a recent photo shoot that we're interested in using on our website or using in all of the really exciting new e-commerce tools that we saw presented this morning. But we might think, oh, our photographer is great, but I, for some reason, don't love this image on the page that I'd like to use it in. And we'll look and we'll see, well, there's this interesting button. What does this button look like? And I hover over it, and I get a tooltip, and it says, Edit with Photoshop. What might that give me today? And I open it, and it gives me some options. I don't quite know what they do, so let's try it out together. So color pop, I was like, well, maybe I do want to color pop my image. And I click it, and it sends some images to some APIs, and we get a response back. And oh, well, the background has been turned to black and white, and our foreground is still have color. And that's really interesting, but it's not exactly what I need for my page, whether I'm writing a blog post or I'm selling a yoga class or what have you. And so I look a little bit more, and I think, well, maybe it's just that these buttons, they look kind of weird. I mean, they don't look weird to me because they're Spectrum buttons, but they might look weird to you because they're not Umbraco buttons. And so I see this new switch, and I say, oh, what if I turn on Umbraco UI? Oh, well, now my interface is also built with Umbraco, and I realized that maybe what I really wanted was this remove background. And so now I click it, and we're seeing some data sent up to the APIs again, and oh, this looks really great. Now my image has no background. This way I can put it on whatever page that I'd like, and so I'm going to save that back into my CMS and use that all across the application and the pages that I'm building for my users. And I'm done with my media editing session. Yeah. Thank you. And so now, the takeaway is that apparently T-Web components, but my apologies, are interoperable across companies. And that means that we have a lot of takeaways for the day, and so I want to run through them with you before we say goodbye, and I let you go to break. First of all, you can leverage the custom elements locator on any web page or application to get an introduction to what custom elements are being leveraged to deliver you that content. Once you know what those elements are, you might start building your own, and when you do, you can use them to lazy load content for your consumers. That lazily loaded content can be really focused on the individual components that you're working on, thanks Shadow DOM. But while you're there, keep in mind the additional work and planning that might come along with that superpower. Because once you have, you'll be able to leverage the web components that you're building, or in some cases, the web components that you're consuming from maybe a company called Umbraco, across various front-end tools. And then you can use that custom element knowledge to wrap micro front-ends so that things that are shared across your applications, your companies, or any number of your consumers can be encapsulated from each other. But be careful, because we're not yet able to put custom elements of the same name or same class definition on either side of that micro front-end boundary without some additional consideration. But then, when you're done, you can leverage those web components across companies, whether it's your company and how you work with Umbraco, or it's your company and how you work with your consumers. And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much for having me today.